Hi, this is Peter Beale, and I just want to do a short lecture on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. This is an important chapter in the study of ethics in philosophy, and what I want to do here is just introduce students to some basic concepts, perhaps in contrast a little bit with the writings of Plato in a similar vein. A great place, I think, to begin is just, of course, to think just for a second about the nature of Aristotle's life and his work. So in terms of situating him chronologically, we're talking the early 4th century, so born in 384 in Thrace, which is in Macedonia, sort of in the northeastern mainland above Greece, above meaning north, and dies in 322 in Chalcis, and spends a lot of time in Athens. That's important to understand. He studies with Plato and eventually sets up his own school, the Lyceum, which offers an alternative, maybe not opposition necessarily to, but certainly an alternative to Plato's own academy. His surviving writings come down to us primarily through lecture notes, and because of that sort of second-hand aspect, and maybe also in terms of the circumstances of their delivery, Aristotle tends to be a harder read and certainly less colorful, less dramatic, certainly, in contrast to Plato's dialogues, which are very much, I think, poetic works as well as philosophical works. A good kind of foundational understanding for Aristotle's philosophy can be seen in terms of his looking at the world as we perceive it, the empirical observation of the world, as opposed to Plato's idealism, is an important concept, I think, when talking about Aristotle. Aristotle thinks of knowledge as not exclusively found in the realm of ideas, especially what we might describe as real reality or true reality, as exemplified in Plato's famous allegory. So Aristotle is more than willing to look at the way the world operates and think about what that might have for us. This is particularly important with regard to ethics, an important aspect of that Greek experiment or investigation, I suppose, in the realm of humanist philosophy and ethics in particular. So what Aristotle is going to look at is how we can act rightly and how we can think clearly about acting rightly, and also not to have this against a kind of single universal standard. So the notion that as we look at how ethics plays out, or ethical behavior, virtuous behavior plays out in action, we understand that ethics are not necessarily relative, but they might be, in terms of the ability to act ethically, relative to an individual capacity. A critical aspect of Aristotle's ethical theory is that we need to be acting in a self-aware fashion. That is to say, we're not going to act ethically by wishful thinking. That is, we're going to just sort of hope for the best or just do, say, what someone tells us. And I think that this is another important aspect. We, in a sense, take responsibility for our actions this way. For Aristotle, good ethical practice finds So for Aristotle, good ethical practice, and it again is action, not just thinking about it, not just talking about it, but good ethical practice or action finds a mean for virtue between conditions that we might associate with vice that would be constituted by an excess or deficit of a virtue. So for instance, again, bravery, too much of it is being foolhardy, too little of it is being a coward. He begins his investigation of this, and again, he's writing in a kind of treatise format. So he sets out basic principles and then derives conclusions from this, but constantly referring, I think, to plausible real-life examples to find agreement from his readers. So he begins right away by stating, with regard to human action, why we do things. So again, taking this, and all the translations will be from this example here from W.D. Ross. Every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit, is thought to aim at some good. So Aristotle's going to argue that everything we do is because of our desire to achieve some good thing. But the question that immediately arises when we think about the sake for which we do things, this good, is that are there sort of subordinate goods? And a classic example of this would be, why do I do something, like why do I go to work, or why do I go to class? And so we might say, well, I do this because I'm, get money, or what have you. And the question would be, why do you get money? And then the next question would be, okay, the answer might be we have money so we can buy things. Well, why do we buy things? And so on down the line. So ultimately, wouldn't there be something that was good that did not rely on a kind of ulterior motive or an aim beyond that? And so let's try to figure out what that particular thing is. And so from the viewpoint of Aristotle, we simply look at people's lives, and then this gives us an idea of what we might, how we might think about this clearly. So for think about this, for most people, argues Aristotle, what we think about the good, and he's going to talk about happiness or eudaimonia, we think about pleasure, and particularly pleasing the senses. So we kind of think about living in such a way that we avoid pain and seek pleasure. Eating good food, or hearing pleasant music, or living in a nice house, or something like this. One of the primary issues with this, of course, is it doesn't really solve a deeper question about what people are going to actually exist for. So we kind of think about that. But he ultimately says this is probably more like being an animal than really being a human. And then there's the aspect of working toward a kind of public approval, what in this translation is described as honor. So participating in the public life of the community, or the polis. The issue with that for Aristotle is, again, maybe there's something beyond that, but also the problem of this good being taken away. That is to say, it's not necessarily inherent in the honored individual. It's not, for instance, necessarily found within him. And that would be a problem for Aristotle, ultimately. We think of doing the right thing not because of the approval of others, but something inherent within ourselves. And then we might think to ourselves, with regard to that what matters more than honor ultimately is in virtue, and that ultimately we would aim for that, and therefore we have to ask ourselves, okay, well, where's virtue found? Okay, and this is sort of where the question sort of wraps up. What's the ultimate goal of human action? And the key thing here is that, again, not all ends are final ends, whether it's money or pleasure or honor. Maybe there's something that's worthy of pursuit for the sake of itself, right? That there's this something final. Okay, what is this thing? Something that's without qualification, is always desirable in itself, and never for the sake of something else. And Aristotle proposes that this thing, happiness, flourishing, the Greek word is eudaimonia, literally translating as good spirit, that's what this is held to be. Okay, for this we all choose always for itself, never for the sake of something else. Honor, pleasure, reason, etc., etc. We choose them also for the sake of happiness, judging that by means of them we'll be happy. Right? And so that's the key thing here. We don't choose to be happy so that we can be rich or anything like that. And again, then Aristotle goes on to say, well, what would human happiness consist of? And for Aristotle, one of the critical things to think about is our unique function. For Aristotle, everything in the world has a kind of place, a purpose, a telos, T-E-L-O-S, for which we were made, and we're, in a sense, working best when we work in accord with that telos. So what is it about human beings that constitutes our unique and special function, our ultimate purpose? And so for him, he says, ultimately, what's going to be going on with us is not a physical function per se, or perception, but indeed our unique rational capacity. So we're happy, in other words, when we're rational, when we act in accordance with reason, when we inculcate virtue in accordance with reason. And this is not a single sort of episode. This is not a sudden dramatic conversion, but instead a long-term process that's developed over the course of a lifetime. And as that famous quote says, the bottom here, for one swallow does not make a summer, nor does one day, and so too one day or a short time does not make a man blessed and happy. Okay, so what is important about virtue? Okay, so we want to sort of think about this. Well, the key thing about virtue, I think, for the Greek philosophers in general, was this is the purpose of existence. This is the primary aspect of our human function, that we exist to operate in conjunction with virtue. This is what furnishes happiness. How do we distinguish virtue from other human acts or states? We think of this, as it says, not only describing it as a state of character, but what sort of a state. As it says, a virtue or excellence brings into good condition the thing of which it is the excellence, and makes the work of that thing be done well. So if we think about this, the virtue of man also will be the state of character which makes a man good and makes him do his work well. So we have this aspect, again, of function. So reason and virtue work together to create the flourishing life. Now the next question, of course, is, well, how do we distinguish or determine a virtuous action? And again, the problem there is, what's the guideline that we're going to use? For Plato, it's to somehow know the good, typically through thought and conversation. For Aristotle, he's thinking again functionally and empirically. And so we ask ourselves, we think about any given virtue or virtuous act and consider it in terms of this sort of sliding scale of excess or deficit. That is to say, any good thing, too little or too much of it, will constitute in some sense of vice. And so he talks, for instance, about at the bottom of this page right here, about eating or any type of effort that we might take, that we find ourselves, we might desire to do something, say run 5 miles. And if we've never run before, going out right away and running 5 miles might actually hurt us. If, on the other hand, we decide not to run at all because running 5 miles is too much, then we're being lazy. So we seek a sort of middle ground, a mean, and that's what the doctrine of the mean is about, to get us on the first step, as it were, to, say, becoming a good runner. And we could apply this in thinking or in any number of other endeavors. So virtue is a state of character concerned with choice. And again, we make this choice. We use our reason to figure out where this is, right? The mean relative to us determined by a rational principle, the principle on which the man of practical wisdom would determine it. So again, practice emphasized here. All right, it's a mean between two vices, excess and deficit, right? It's a mean because the vices respectively fall short or exceed of what is right in our passions and our actions. Virtue finds and chooses that which is intermediate, that which again fulfills that function. It's certainly not an easy thing to do, okay? And this is, again, a situation dependent on our individual capacities as actors, our mental or physical or any other types of capacities. It could be material resources as well, to take an example. And so we have to exercise, right, as it says, these virtues, doing it to the right person, to the right extent, at the right time, with the right motive in the right way, right? Not just following a kind of template or pattern that one size fits all, but indeed individual to ourselves and to the situation, and yet fulfilling this condition of virtue as he finishes this passage here. So goodness is both rare and laudable and noble. So what does this imply in the end? Again, for Aristotle, the key is virtuous action makes us virtuous, not merely thinking about virtue. Virtuous action has to take into account that potential for excess or deficit of virtue, creating vice, especially in relation to the actor in a particular situation. The virtuous person must exercise his or her reason in determining this virtuous action. And again, active reasoning being our unique capacity or function, our telos as humans, leading to our happiness or flourishing, our good spirit or eudaimonia.